הרדיו הבינתחומי. בינתחומי. 106.2 FM. הרדיו הבינתחומי. הרדיו החינוכי של המרכז הבינתחומי. לכל ישראל. 106.2 FM.
Terrorism's global impact. Highlights from the ICT's 11th International Conference. With Edan Landau.
Good afternoon and welcome to the IDC radio on 106.2 FM and 106.2fm.co.il on the internet. We're here for a special broadcast with the 11th World Summit on Counter-Terrorism, hosted by the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism. I'm Edan Landau and I'm here with Dr. Rohan Gunaratna, who is the head of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Welcome.
Thank you.
I understand that you were participating in some of the workshops, Countering Violent Extremism and Radicalization, Evolution of Global Jihad. Can you give us an overview of those workshops, what was discussed in them?
The workshops were outstanding because they brought together both practitioners and analysts, people who have worked in the field hunting terrorists, hunting extremists, and trying to engage the Muslim communities to ensure that they don't descend towards imbibing those extremist ideas. But also we had a set of analysts who have studied the problem, looked at the most strategic dimensions. So it was a brilliant interaction between practitioners and analysts. So in many ways I want to congratulate the World Summit. It's the largest terrorism conference in the world today for having created this dynamic. It brought to light two issues. One is that the threat of terrorism is growing. The threat of terrorism has not plateaued 10 years after 9/11, and that governments need, in parallel with the tactical response to terrorism, that is catch, kill, disrupt, in parallel to that, to develop more capabilities to engage the communities, the vulnerable communities, and also to build programs to counter extremism, that is the vicious propaganda and the ideology infecting the Muslim communities. So it discussed what are the new strategies that must be used in the coming years to fight terrorism.
One of the ways that we actually analyze what's going on in the terrorist community is through the websites. A lot of the radicalization is also being done on the websites. Can you give us any insight into that?
Today we all live in two different worlds. We live in the real world and we live in the cyber world. So some people spend more time in the cyber world than in the real world. And of course there are about 6,000 to 7,000 extremist and terrorist websites, and most of these websites are hosted in the United States. And through these 6,000 to 7,000 websites, terrorist and extremist groups are propagating their ideology. They're disseminating propaganda. They're trying to recruit raise funds, coordinate operations. And there was consensus at the World Summit that Americans and service providers, both the government and the service providers, must do something about it, because otherwise we will have a new generation of extremists, people who support terrorism, and terrorists, operational terrorists who conduct terrorist attacks, radicalized and politicized and mobilized through the internet. Internet has become the principal radicalizer of the new wave of terrorism we are witnessing.
I'd like to talk about some of the themes that are on those websites. And recently we've seen more an approach towards the younger generation. By younger generation I mean actual children. I think one of the sites, one of the websites is discussing putting up a cartoon specifically targeting children and radicalizing them. We've also seen a pamphlet with how to radicalize children on a different site. How dangerous is this?
It is, because these extremist and terrorist websites are specifically appealing to Muslim youth, including children. So they will use Mickey Mouse cartoons and a lot of other ways of reaching out to the younger population. And we discussed specific strategies of countering that message. And I think it's something very new, and we need to develop a very comprehensive plan to protect our youth, basically to immunize the youth by raising their awareness, raising the awareness of parents, of teachers. And if we don't do this, certainly we will have younger people who will join as sympathizers, supporters of these groups, and it will become a threat. And if you look at the terrorist attacks and plots in the last 10 years in the United States, there have been 175 homegrown plots and attacks mounted. And in the last 3 years, 50% of those attempts and plots have taken place in the last 3 years. So homegrown terrorism is becoming a big problem. And almost all the homegrown terrorists are driven by through the internet, through radical and extremist websites.
Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula has issued the Inspire magazine in English. There is a debate whether it's actually radicalizing or it's being used, or the media is actually the one that's scaring the public. What role does the media actually have in this whole operation of terrorists, basically?
Media shapes public opinion, and unless media professionals, that means the media moguls, the media gatekeepers, and the scribes, the people who write, people who produce broadcasts or telecast, these media personnel have to take the responsibility more seriously. One must never exaggerate, and one must never air hate speech. One must be extremely careful so that the media will not become a radicalizer. We have seen even prime ministers, presidents, ministers appearing on media shows that are sponsored by terrorist and extremist groups, because there are terrorist and extremist groups that have their own media organizations. So I think that we have to address this in a multiple way. One is, we have to ensure that we tell the service providers, look, we are going to take action against you. We should also caution governments from allowing these media organizations like Media, which is the PKK television station, or the Lebanese Hezbollah television station, Al-Mana, these stations from operating. So, and also we have to advise other private stations to be very cautious of what they air. Certainly if you have a program on terrorism and that program is going to make some people angry and give more support and assistance and more sympathy, generates more sympathy for terrorism, then that media organization is not doing what is right. So there needs to be more focus on this aspect, because the terrorists hope to harness the existing communications platforms to air their message. If you take Inspire, the magazine where Anwar Avlaki, the AKAP leader, features, why is he writing in English? Because he wants to reach out to English-speaking Muslims globally, to recruit them as sympathizers, as supporters, as financiers. So this age, during this period, we have to be very careful that media is not being exploited, media is not being abused by these terrorist and extremist groups.
Is it possible that a magazine like this is actually not designated as radicalizing, but more its purpose is to actually have, cause the media to cause the scare?
I think it's doing both.
We could call it media-based terrorism, maybe.
Yes, it is radicalizing people, but it is also very attractive, very seductive, So it is written in that vein. But certainly there must be more awareness of mainstream media organizations of what they put in the air, what they broadcast, what they telecast, what they print.
Now that bin Laden has been killed, only recently, how does it actually affect Al-Qaeda? I mean, is Al-Qaeda really on its way down?
Al-Qaeda is a shadow of itself. At its peak, its membership was 3,000 to 4,000 members. That's at 9/11. But 10 years after, its membership is a few hundred. And most of their operations are very localized. Al-Qaeda itself has transformed from an operational organization that mounted attacks into a propaganda organization and an organization that is doing training and providing inspiration, instigation for attacks rather than doing the attacks itself. But during this 10-year period, Al-Qaeda has infected 30 to 40 different groups in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to behave like Al-Qaeda, to mount suicide attacks like Al-Qaeda, to hate the United States, to hate Europe, to hate Israelis, to hate the other regimes in the Middle East. So Al-Qaeda in many ways has completed its mission. Al-Qaeda still poses a threat. I think that it is important to focus on this group and dismantle this group. The same way bin Laden was killed, it's important either to capture or kill Ayman al-Zawahiri because he is also a very capable leader. But certainly the core of the terrorist movement, that is Al-Qaeda, has been very gravely damaged. And I only hope that there will be more coordination and cooperation between governments now to disrupt and degrade the capabilities of the other 30 terrorist groups.
One of those groups is Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. And we've seen many reports coming out of Yemen where they take control over land, they lose control over land, you don't actually know who's winning and who's losing. At the same time, the West, for some reason, has decided that Anwar al-Awlaki is the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. What's actually going on down there?
Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, was largely in Saudi Arabia, but because of Saudi counter-terrorism efforts, the group has now moved from Saudi to Yemen. I visited Yemen last year. I visited Saudi Arabia twice. And based on our own assessment of the group, AQAP today presents a much bigger threat than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula conducted a number of attacks. It sent the underwear bomber, Umar Farooq Abdul Muttalib, to Detroit. It did the cartridge bomb attacks that would have destroyed cargo planes. It also tried to kill the assistant interior minister, Prince Naif, in Saudi Arabia. We see that Al-Qaeda led by bin Laden then and now by Ayman al-Zawahiri has diminished in its operational capabilities. But AQAP, AQIM, AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the offspring of Al-Qaeda has become more powerful, more prominent. And that is why we need to focus on these groups. The leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is not Anwar al-Awlaki. It is a man called Buhaishi. He was a former secretary of bin Laden. But Anwar al-Awlaki is like the key ideologue of that group. And it is so important to kill or capture both of them because this group now presents a very significant and a real threat, not only to Yemen, but to the entire region and beyond.
Where do you think the next main theater of jihad will be, if you can venture a guess?
Yemen certainly is important, but Somalia is equally important. I believe that the Afghan-Pakistan border, which is the epicenter of international terrorism, will remain a significant center, especially if the Americans withdraw from Afghanistan. But I see that these two new theaters have emerged in Yemen and in Somalia, and it is very likely, unless there is more effort to stabilize Libya itself may become a very important center for fighting. And of course, in Libya, we have seen the proliferation of weapons, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which has been active in North Africa, primarily in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Libya. These group is now operating in the Sahalan region, that is Niger, Chad, Mali, Mauritania. It is likely that the threat in this region may also grow. So if you look at the four most important theaters of jihad, I'll say one is Afghan-Pakistan area, second is Yemen, third is Somalia, fourth is the Sahalan Maghreb region.
Do you think it Al-Qaeda will actually gain a foothold in Egypt or in Syria?
In Egypt, yes, it is possible if the chaos remains, if there is no economic stability. Tunisia, Egypt, AQIM will start to operate. The old Egyptian groups may revive at least some factions. In Syria, Lebanon, that region, there are some Al-Qaeda associate groups. The Levant region, certainly terrorism can re-emerge in that area. So I think that the post-Arab Spring, or particularly after Egypt and Tunisia and Libya, one has to be very careful. I think that this entire region, there may be rise of Islamism, and if that happens, all these groups will come back, and it will bring about greater instability to this region.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gunaratna. It's been a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you.
And have a safe flight home.
Thank you.
הרדיו הבינתחומי